Coming up this weekend with the long-awaited return of Oklahoma's own, the Brick, Jimmy Flick, throwing up the promo like he's Brian Bosworth in the 90s, and he's making his return against a former LFA flyweight champion in Charles Johnson, and I should say fellow former LFA flyweight champ, because both of these guys occupied that similar space over with that promotion, and neither one of these guys, surprisingly, in their long pro careers, have matched up against one another, and that's what makes this matchup so much fun. But for Jimmy Flick, I mean, he came into the UFC with so many triangle wins. Everybody knew him outside of the promotion for that one such fact. But if you go and you watch this fight in his UFC debut against Cody Durden, oh my gosh, like, we haven't seen that since UFC, 129? Pablo Garza throwing up the flying triangle?
Don't act like you remember that.
Not something that you do see all that often. That was a big GSP card, Matt. That was Jose Aldo, Mark Hominick. But if you do look at the matchup that we have coming up this weekend, both these guys very, very similar in their styles, with the one respect that they like to take the fight down to the mat, and they have a lot of their success once it finds itself there.
Without a doubt. My big concern, though, in this matchup, and I think why the odds are reflected where they are, is this is a really difficult fight for Jimmy Flick to be taking, making his, I guess, return to the UFC after a lengthy retirement, because that's what it was for Jimmy Flick. It's not like he had, just taken time off and couldn't get matchups. Like, MMA was out of his life. He had, it wasn't really a press conference, but he had made an announcement in the LFA ring, I believe. It was
it was actually the SCF ring back in Oklahoma in 2021.
Perfect. So, yeah, he had announced his retirement there, and I completely thought, okay, that's it for Jimmy Flick. He's going to be one of those weird MMA what-ifs, and it'll be like, hey, remember that time he flying triangled Cody Durden?
The craziest part about it was the quotable. He said, "There's no benefits of beating up my body up no more in the UFC. We have no 401k, we have no benefits, we have no fallback. Fighters are too stupid to unionize, and it'll never happen because there's a lot of other fighters that will fight for that money." So he seemed like he had not just one foot out the door. Like, he had jumped out a couple of days ago, and people didn't realize he was gone.
And now he's back. And that might be a good sign. Like, maybe he has been able to revitalize himself. Maybe the time away from the sport has made him realize how much he misses it. Maybe it's making him train even harder as a result. I just think making your return against Charles Johnson is going to be really difficult. And I know people might be down on Johnson. He had a close fight to Zhalgas Zhumagulov his last time out. He got mopped by Makayev his first time. Let's just call it what it was. That was not a competitive fight whatsoever. But if we're giving Makayev the respect he deserves, and I think we have to, he might be the best prospect we've seen in this division in years. And that's not hyperbole either. Like, Makayev's grappling is so dominant that once he gets it down to the mat, he's going to be able to out-wrestle a lot of guys in this division. So I don't really think we have seen the best version of Charles Johnson. So maybe it's difficult for me to sit here and really sell you a package on him to where, hey, he's going to go out there and not only out-wrestle Jimmy Flick, but beat him up on the feet, use some of his volume, use some of his footwork. I keep on going back to Flick and worrying about that time off and worrying about that word retirement. I just never think it's a great sign when a guy's making his return all of a sudden.
Well, and there's two ways to look at this, because originally this was supposed to be Jeff Molina to take on Jimmy Flick, and on December the 5th, it was announced by Mike Heck that Charles Johnson would be taking the fight. That's a week after Charles Johnson fought Zhalgas Zhumagulov that he's thrown into another camp to take this one. So again, you get to be fresh. Now, his last time out, split decision win over Zhalgas Zhumagulov. Majority of people thought that Zhalgas ended up winning that fight. MMA decisions 12-1 for Zhumagulov over Johnson, but we know Zhalgas. Now,
it was a close fight. It's not like Zhalgas ran over him.
No, he retired after. Majority of people, though, thinking that Zhumagulov won. But if you do look at it for Charles Johnson, everything that's going to be said around the fact that he was a two-time national steeplechase champion, and he was an AAU national track and field athlete with the University of Arkansas Pine Bluff, as well as Southeastern Missouri State. But when you watch Charles Johnson, and we talk all about his LFA career and how good he is with his cardio and his 5-round cardio, and he turns it on rounds 3, 4, and 5, the trouble that Charles Johnson has in a lot of his fights, against Zhumagulov, against Moda, against some of these other guys, Brandon Royval is another example, he struggles to get it going in round number 1, and he can really get behind on the strikes. And one thing that Johnson will do is the fact that he had a pro boxing career from 2017 to 2019. He went 1-5-4, and he did win a 2019 Tiger Muay Thai scholarship to go over and train at the gym. If you watch the way that Charles Johnson fights, it's kind of odd, because they might bill him as a boxer, and he does shell up like a boxer, and he does fight in a boxing stance to where you can get scored on points for defense in boxing. But the way that Johnson shells up and waits and doesn't tend to counter, he gets himself behind on some of the MMA scorecards. Now, against a guy like Jimmy Flick, that might not
in years.
That might not be the case, because Flick, again, he hasn't fought in a very, very meaningful amount of time. And if we do switch it back to Flick and you look at it 14 of his 16 wins are by submission. 8 of them are by triangle, and he is a specialist once he gets it down to the mat. And he has fought some big names. I know Ray Rodriguez was one, Levi Mowles on the regional scene. Guys like Sean O'Grady and Adan De La Garza. Those are guys that nobody really knows unless you're friends or family. But if you do focus on it for Flick, unorthodox striking, mixes in that great submission ability. And I know a lot of people like that in flying triangle that Paddy Pimblett had over with Cage Warriors. It's a big one, but it's not a submission that you see very often. But Flick is so adept with his submissions that for Charles Johnson, we talk about the cardio, we talk about the boxing, the striking. Johnson's biggest strength is getting his opponents down to the mat, getting them to turn over, and then landing really, really vicious ground and pound when he can get his own back mount. And he is an expert at getting back mount in some of these fights.
He's the more damaging fighter of the two once it gets to the mat. With Flick, it is much more submission over everything. It's not to say he has poor ground and pound. It's just not what he's looking for when he's on the mat. I think if Johnson does get Flick down, Flick might be threatening with submission, still be an active grappler off of his back, but I think he is going to be eating damage from that top position from Johnson. Again, Flick might go on to be the flyweight champion. I can't pick him, though, in his first fight back coming off retirement at the age of 32. It's one of those fights where I might get this one wrong, and I can openly admit that, just to have a better idea as to what Jimmy Flick's going to look like in the future, because he was such a talented fighter the last time we saw him. He won in about the craziest possible way you can in an MMA cage. There was a lot of potential there. I just don't really like the opponent he's coming back to with all the kind of what-ifs there's been left around Jimmy Flick the last 2 years.
Yeah, and I mean, for Charles Johnson, much has been noted about the fact that the betting line completely switched throughout this, and with Fight Night picks, we're not going to focus on that as much in 2023, but if we do look at the Tapology votes, Matt, surprise to us, they are to you. And I'm going to say this before you have a look at them. I'm on the fence about the pick, to be completely honest with everybody, because the strengths that Charles Johnson possesses on the mat, Jimmy Flick can nullify a lot of those. So I'm going to say over under 70% Johnson. You know what? I'm going to say over under 80% Charles Johnson, just because of that recency factor.
I was going to say over 70. I'll say under 80.
I'm going to say under 80. 1,245 total votes on Tapology, 51% Flick, 66% by submission. For the 49% that have Johnson, it's about 61% by decision. So the fans have Jimmy Flick by 1%, and I'm on the fence. So, yeah, I do have a hard time. You already tipped your hand, though. You're going with Charles Johnson.
There's a boxer named Mikey Garcia, and he was awesome years ago, and then he took a really long time off because he had all these weird promotional mishaps, if you will, and it just cost him a lot of his prime. Then he came back and fought Earl Spence Jr., and a lot of people got excited for it. You know what happened in that fight? Earl Spence Jr. beat the brakes off him. And I know that this is a very different level of that, but still, Charles Johnson has at least been active and competing, and he does have good volume. I know you bring up the Jean Gas fight. Both those guys landed over 100 strikes in that matchup, so for Johnson, I do share some of those same concerns that you have about the slow starts, but I don't think Flick's the guy who's really going to go out there burning super hot after all this time off.
Charles Johnson makes a major mistake in all of his fights when he goes for his takedowns, whether it's double or single leg. He leaves his neck completely out to the, I guess it'd be the right-hand side of every opponent. Jimmy Flick, you want to call him...
It's so difficult not to do that every time, I know.
You want to call him Jiminy Glick and start doing the Kiefer, but we won't do that here. Jimmy Flick can definitely submit him. I have Charles Johnson ever so slightly, but my goodness, I think Jimmy Flick has a great opportunity in this fight. So both of us going with Johnson, but my goodness, if I've ever seen a popcorn fight, this is definitely it.
And hopefully we just get one of those fun scramble matchups where we just get to learn more about both these guys, because for Johnson, it has been a really tough run the last two fights, and for Flick, it has been a lot of time off. So just for both these guys, I don't think this is a loser kind of leaves town deal. Hopefully both guys get another opportunity, because they're both very talented fighters.
Couple of guys looking for their second win under the UFC banner. It should be a great one in the ever-changing flyweight division. Some great fights on this card, including a middleweight headliner between Nasruddin Imavov and Kelvin Gastelum. You're not going to want to miss it. Keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks. We always say, let's get into it.